Imagine someone who has tracked every single dollar for 3 years straight. They know exactly how much they spend on groceries, on subscriptions, on coffee, on everything. They have a color-coded spreadsheet that would impress any financial advisor, and every month they hit their targets almost perfectly. They're disciplined, consistent, and genuinely committed to improving their financial life. And yet, after 3 years of near-perfect budgeting, their net worth has barely moved. Their savings account has grown modestly, but the gap between where they are and where they want to be feels just as wide as it did when they started. This is not a story about failure. This is actually a story about a very common misunderstanding, one that the personal finance industry has quietly encouraged for decades. And it begins with a fundamental confusion between managing money and actually building it. Budgeting is a tool of subtraction. Its entire logic is built around the idea that if you spend less than you earn, the difference accumulates over time and eventually becomes wealth. And on the surface, that sounds completely reasonable. The problem is that this framework treats income as a fixed ceiling rather than a variable you can actively expand, and it treats wealth as something that grows linearly through restraint rather than exponentially through deployment. When you operate purely inside a budgeting mindset, your financial strategy is essentially capped by whatever your current income happens to be. You can optimize the inputs and outputs all you want, but you cannot budget your way past the ceiling that your income creates. A person earning $40,000 a year with a perfect budget will still accumulate wealth far more slowly than a person earning $80,000 with an average one. And that gap widens dramatically when you introduce the concept of invested capital producing its own returns. The history of personal finance advice in the Western world is deeply rooted in the post-war middle-class experience, a period when steady employment, employer pensions, and relatively affordable housing meant that disciplined saving genuinely was enough for most people to reach a comfortable retirement. The budgeting-first philosophy emerged from that context, and it made a great deal of sense inside that specific economic environment. But the economic architecture that made budgeting sufficient has largely dissolved over the past 4 decades. Pension systems have been replaced by individual contribution plans that transfer market risk onto employees. Housing costs in most major markets have grown far faster than wages. The cost of education, healthcare, and basic services has compounded in ways that erode purchasing power in ways that a tighter grocery budget simply cannot offset. Budgeting was designed for an economic era that no longer exists for most people, and yet it remains the dominant framework through which most financial education is delivered. What budgeting misses entirely is the mathematics of compounding, and specifically the way that compounding changes its behavior at different thresholds of deployed capital. There is a meaningful mathematical difference between having $10,000 invested and having $100,000 invested that goes beyond the obvious tenfold increase in principal. At $10,000 in a diversified portfolio returning an average of 8% annually, your money generates $800 per year in growth. That is a number that feels encouraging, but does not yet meaningfully change your financial trajectory. At $100,000, that same 8% return generates $8,000 per year, a figure that begins to approximate a meaningful secondary income stream. At $250,000, the annual return at 8% reaches $20,000, and at that level, the compounding begins to behave in ways that feel genuinely transformative because the returns themselves are large enough to accelerate the compounding further without any additional contribution from you. The critical insight here is that reaching these thresholds requires not just saving, but strategically deploying capital into assets that generate returns, and a budgeting framework alone provides no mechanism for doing that. It tells you to spend less. It does not tell you where the difference should go or how to make that difference work harder than you ever could through restraint alone. There is also a psychological dimension to the budgeting trap that rarely gets examined with the seriousness it deserves. When your primary financial framework is built around restriction, around saying no to spending, around monitoring limits, around treating every dollar as something to be carefully rationed, it gradually trains your mind to relate to money through the lens of scarcity. And a scarcity relationship with money has measurable cognitive consequences. Research in behavioral economics has consistently demonstrated that people operating under conditions of financial scarcity, whether real or perceived, show reduced capacity for long-term thinking, increased susceptibility to short-term decision traps, and a narrowed attentional focus that makes it difficult to identify and act on opportunities that exist outside the immediate budget frame. In other words, the very discipline of extreme budgeting can inadvertently reinforce the psychological patterns that make wealth building harder. You become so focused on the subtractive side of the equation that the expansive side, income growth, investment strategy, asset accumulation, fades from view almost entirely. This does not mean budgeting has no value. Understanding where your money goes is a legitimate and necessary first step in building financial awareness, and the discipline of tracking expenses creates habits of attention that transfer well into other areas of financial management. But there is a significant difference between using a budget as a diagnostic tool and using it as a wealth strategy. The diagnostic function of budgeting is genuinely useful. It reveals patterns, identifies inefficiencies, and creates a baseline from which smarter decisions can be made. The problem arises when the diagnostic becomes the destination, when the act of maintaining the budget becomes confused with the act of building wealth, when the spreadsheet becomes the goal rather than the map. The wealthiest individuals and families across recorded economic history have almost universally shared one structural characteristic that has nothing to do with how carefully they monitored their expenses. They owned assets that generated returns independent of their personal labor. Whether those assets were land, businesses, financial instruments, intellectual property, or some combination of all of these, the defining feature of durable wealth is that it compounds on its own while the person who owns it sleeps, works, or does nothing at all. Budgeting, at its core, is a labor-dependent strategy. Every dollar saved requires an active decision, an act of restraint, a moment of discipline. Invested capital, by contrast, works continuously and without requiring any further effort once it has been deployed. The shift from a budgeting mindset to an ownership and deployment mindset is not just a tactical adjustment in how you manage money, it is a fundamental reorientation in how you understand the relationship between time, capital, and wealth creation. The practical implication of all this is not that you should abandon financial discipline or stop paying attention to how you spend. It is that financial discipline is the floor, not the ceiling. It is the minimum condition for not falling behind, not the strategy for getting ahead. Once you have stabilized your cash flow and eliminated high-interest debt, the most important financial question you can ask is not where can I cut next, but rather where should I deploy what I have so that it begins generating returns that are independent of my labor. That question, simple as it sounds, represents a completely different relationship with money than the one that most budgeting frameworks are built to foster. And the moment you begin genuinely living inside that question, rather than inside the spreadsheet, something in your financial trajectory begins to shift in ways that no amount of careful expense tracking ever could have produced on its own.